Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome to the breaking news. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, link in the description below. Starting with our first bit of breaking news today, Russian forces are apparently being overwhelmed by a massive Ukrainian attack that is occurring within the direction of Verbove at this very moment. According to Russian forces, the firefight is so heavy that evacuations of even the ones who have died is completely impossible at the moment. This information came out from the Intel Crab and was put out by Igor Girkin's Telegram page, saying that according to the Russian forces there, the firefight is so strong, they are currently not able to evacuate the wounded or the dead at this moment. Of course, that's not shocking. Russian forces appear to never really evacuate the wounded and dead, but the fact that they're making a special statement about this means that there is no way for Russian forces to move around the village of Verbove at this very moment, at any part of it, to evacuate anyone, regardless of their position, regardless of the wounds, or regardless of their status, whether living or dead. Not only that, but we've seen that the fire maps around Verbove are also showing that massive fires have been breaking out practically around everything surrounding Verbove. It appears that there are three massive fields of fire, one to the direct north of the center part of the village, one to the southwest, and it appears that that is a part of a Ukrainian advance that we'll be talking about in a second, and then a massive field of fire back here in these several fields. In fact, this field of fire is so large, it actually encompasses nearly 4 or 5 entire farm fields right outside of the village. This is all major news, and especially with the massive fires that have been breaking out, it's possibly showing how far Ukrainian forces have been able to make it, or where Russian forces are getting hit the hardest. From what we understood before the battle unfolded today, Ukrainian forces had actually started to wrap around the outside of Verbove to its southern end and also its northern end as well. When we move to Verbove on the map, and we take a look at the size and scale of the village, you can see that there are several positions that the Russians would probably be keen to hold, and the Ukrainians would also be keen to capture. One of these is where one of those fire fields was spotted. This appears to be a slight ridge line to the direct southwest of Verbove that could probably give the Russians a commanding position over the next several fields in front of Verbove, and therefore, the silencing of the Russian guns on that hill and the capturing of the position would not only allow the Ukrainians to have further control of the Surovikin line that is around this direction where the mouse cursor is moving outside of Verbove, but it would also allow the Ukrainian forces a commanding firing position looking down into the rest of the village of Verbove, and possibly would start to force Russian forces to be pinned down or to withdraw from those areas of the village. Not only that, but the massive fire that we were seeing back towards the very northeastern side of the village, in these fields up here, appears to be conducive to satellite imagery showing that this area had been heavily shelled for quite a while before this battle even began. This satellite footage actually came out at some point in late 2023. We're believing it's June or July, and even around a month ago, you could see visible damage from artillery shells being created on these fields, showing that this may be a preferred spot for Russian artillerists to operate, or it may be a supply hub and an open-air supply cache that is being operated by the Russian forces that keeps the Verbove garrison running. At the moment, we know that there are currently 2 mechanized rifle brigades working in this area on the part of the Russian army, trying to defend the village, but from what we're understanding, this is going to be incredibly tough for them to do. There's even been rumors and reports at the moment that the Ukrainian forces have already taken most of Verbove, but we have not been able to confirm that with any actual hardcore statements. All we've been hearing right now are rumors that supposedly come from the front lines, but beyond that, we don't really know exactly how far the Ukrainians have made it. One thing that we're quite certain about, however, is that while we don't know how much of the village the Ukrainians have actually taken, they have certainly moved around the southern flank about to where this mouse cursor is, and in the northern flank, they are now holding this small roadway that you see moving up towards Pavlivske. We are able to confirm that Ukrainian forces have made it that far on the outsides of the village, but we have not been able to confirm if Ukrainian forces have entered the village and started to forcefully clear house by house down the street that Verbove sits on. Regardless, it is a massive change, especially in what we've been hearing at Verbove. Verbove has also been a bit of a tougher battle than was expected, considering that the only forces that the Ukrainians were able to bring against the Russian defense there at Verbove was light infantry for a small while, as no crossing had actually been made over the Surovikin lines, which exist right outside of the village. We can actually see these on satellite footage on Google Maps, but they do exist and are quite extensive as far as the defensive position goes. The Ukrainians were able to cross this around 2.5 weeks ago, but just a few days ago, Ukrainian engineers were finally able to bulldoze some crossings over these open anti-tank ditches, which then allowed for larger amounts of Ukrainian armor and support vehicles to cross over the Surovikin line and then begin supporting those infantry forces that have been fighting outside of Verbove for around 2.5 weeks at that point. This is giving the Ukrainians a massive advantage. From what we can understand, Russian armor is having an incredibly difficult time entering the village of Verbove. Having only one road to enter from, which starts at Tarasivka, it appears that it's created a bit of a choke point that Russian armor has not been able to enter through. The fields leading up to Verbove are largely inhospitable to Russian armor as well. With somewhat larger ravines behind the village of Verbove, it largely necessitates that this choke point is the only way that Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers are able to enter the village and Russian forces are able to leave from if they want to use a vehicle. And so because of this, we understand that the Ukrainians probably have an upper hand advantage against Russian forces, considering that they are probably the only ones at Verbove that are able to field larger armored forces. The Russians, of course, due to the aforementioned shortcomings of the defensive position, are most likely not able to bring up a large amount of armor, if any at all, meaning that they are going to be relying entirely on the infantry within Verbove and the anti-tank weaponry that they have, if available, to try and stop the Ukrainian armor from decimating their infantry forces that are inside of the village. We also heard equally promising news from the area of Novoprokopivka, and it was confirmed in the past 16 hours that the Ukrainians now control half of the village of Novoprokopivka, a massive change from previous days where the VDV forces holding this highway have been able to hold Novoprokopivka without Ukrainian forces entering. But according to the Kyiv Independent and news that has been sourced from the military, the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues operations in the Melitopol sector, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces announced on September 24th. And this also comes with an additional statement that additional amount of ground has been eked out around the village of Novoprokopivka, and we may be seeing that Ukrainian forces will start to move past the highway and towards Ilchinkove, which is right down here, and is an incredibly small chain of villages that intersects the Surovikin line in between Solodka Balka in Ilchinkove. Most of the Surovikin line's defensive positions actually pass directly in between Ilchinkove and Solodka Balka. This actually creates a bit of a weak point, oddly enough, because while the village does allow for some extra defensive positions, if the Ukrainians advance into Ilchinkove and start to take the village, this means that they will be looking directly onto the Surovikin line, which is stacked right behind the village, once the Ukrainians make it there, meaning that the Surovikin line loses a lot of its defensive ability there, because instead of fighting the Ukrainians at distance and creating a formidable defensive structure that can't even be reached, the Ukrainians will have reached the defensive line and the Russians will be fighting almost inside of it once the Ukrainians make it there. But at the moment, the Ukrainians are still fighting in Novoprokopivka, and it appears that initial news today has been quite promising in the Melitopol axis. We don't know how successful this will be. The VDV is obviously starting to struggle with the defense of Novoprokopivka, but we haven't gotten any confirmed information that the VDV is beginning to go through some sort of a collapse. We have been able to confirm that the 803rd Brigade of the Russian Federation was completely destroyed today in the fighting in between Verbove and Novoprokopivka, as it had been further decimated during the Balaklia counteroffensive of last year, and then its remnants were moved into the area of Verbove and were attached to the motorized rifle brigade that is currently fighting there. From information that the Institute for the Study of War has been able to find, it was then completely destroyed today, and it has now been so thoroughly leveled that it's most likely, well, its remaining elements are most likely going to be joined with the motorized rifle brigade it was already attached to, and that unit will cease to exist. It will most likely be stricken from the roster. But moving on from the area around Verbove and Novoprokopivka, where we're starting to hear of massive fights, and of course we don't have a lot of footage of it at the moment, most likely for operational security reasons, but these fights are monumental in scale, especially for the size of villages that they're fighting for. The kind of firefights that we would be witnessing, if we could see them on film, would probably be more severe and more devastating than the battles we saw for Bakhmut, just given the small area that they're occurring in. But moving on out of that part of the front line, we also heard today that an explosion occurred near the Kursk airfield that the Russian Air Force uses, and we got to hear about that from Clash Report that stated that the Russian military sources indicate Ukrainian strikes hit the Kursk Vostochny airport, or Kursk Kalino, today. Casualties were reported over radio, but the Russian Ministry of Defense has made no such announcement claiming that any damage has occurred. They state, on the other hand, that everything is fine and nothing has happened. This picture here supposedly shows the Kursk airport, or at least some of the aircraft that you would find there. And we can see an Su-30 flanker here in the background, and we can also see two MiG-29 SMTs, which is a modernized version of the MiG-29 that the Russian Federation likes to use as their more so small air-to-air fighter. We can also see that these have R-73s, which are their all-aspect short-range missiles, and they also have larger R-73s attached as well, actually R-24s attached as well, although we don't know exactly what variant of R-24 that is. Regardless, if these aircraft were damaged and destroyed, they're incredibly expensive, believe it or not, although being a MiG-29, and the monetary damage cost to the Russian Federation might be significant, but at the moment we don't know the exact losses that have occurred at that airfield. Meanwhile, in Poland, we've heard some really good news that the Polish and Ukrainians have finally come up with a solution of what to do with Ukrainian grain, which is building up in excess, and no one really knows what to do with it at the moment. According to a statement from the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, Poland has prepared transit corridors for Ukrainian grain, and they're prepared to create the transit corridors for Ukrainian grain to pass through and be exported to wherever it is needed. And that was the statement from the Polish president. Based off of that statement, we have an incredibly good idea that the Polish are not going to be allowing the Ukrainian grains to be sold any further within their own domestic markets. Currently, from what we understand, the Polish agricultural industry is hanging on by a thread due to the almost predatory prices that Ukrainian grain has been sold at in their markets for nearly a year at this point. Because of that, we are most likely going to be seeing that this grain will be transported further on into Europe to a country like Germany, or maybe even the larger ports within France, Germany, and the Netherlands, where it will then further be shipped on to other countries such as Saudi Arabia, China, and maybe even Egypt. This is most likely a smart move by everyone involved. It ensures that the Polish farmers will be protected from any kinds of prices that they can't compete with, and it'll also ensure that Ukrainian grain can actually make it to those foreign markets, which it has not been able to make it to successfully, and finally be sold at a price that it is worth, meaning that everyone kind of wins in the end, and this is a great resolution to a problem that seemed to be almost impossible to overcome, and yet the Polish and Ukrainians have finally made an agreement that benefits both of them, which is a great way to resolve that story. But with that, that is largely all of the breaking news we have today. Of course, if y'all want to hear more about what's happening at Verbove, we'll most likely have more news tonight during our Sunday fundraiser. Make sure to show up. We'll be helping out a nonprofit operating in Ukraine. And we'll also hopefully have additional video footage showing what is actually going on at Verbove, because at the moment, we don't have any video footage, but we probably will a few hours later on tonight. But of course, thank you all so much once again for watching. It's an absolute honor to cover these short war summaries with y'all, and I will see you all in the next one.